Now, I think that Sadr then realized, obviously, even before he decided to withdraw his MPs, that he'd come to a dead end. He tried to convince some of his counterparts in the framework to jump boats. There are some, let's say, moderate leaders among them that are more pragmatic that would have been willing to do so. But we also know that there are external powers, essentially, or mainly Iran, that is trying to keep the so-called Shia house together. Now, obviously, Sadr has put himself outside of that, but it was very important to keep the rest of them together, and I think they succeeded in doing so. So since then, Sadr withdrawing his MPs, the framework has kind of kept its line, right? Which is that Iraq should go to form a government, irrespective of Sadr wants to be in it or not. And of course, this is what sort of led to the provocations and counter-provocations from both sides in terms of what we saw as actually erupting in clashes inside the Green Zone. Now, I don't think that it actually had, let's say, the risk of escalating into civil strife or intra-Shia fighting at a larger scale at this point. The underlying conditions may very well be there, but I think that there are two specific reasons why this wouldn't happen right now. One of them is that there is no appetite in the region for instability in Iraq. In contrast to 15 years ago, when some of the regional countries actually kind of contributed to instability in Iraq. And the second thing is that oil prices are very high. The entire political elite is interested in seeing a government being formed simply because there has been no regular budget being passed for 2022. They would very much like to see that happen for 2023. So,
sorry, Laheeb, can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's thank you for really a great overview of the political crisis and telling us a lot about the structural weaknesses of the system. With the two-third rule in place, what does another election mean? Because now we're talking about scenarios, and another early election is seen as a likely scenario ahead. With the two-thirds rule in place, with the same parties competing for the next elections, so what does early election mean for the country, for the problems, for the structural problems you have just explained?
Well, look, I see that early elections might be a solution in terms of, let's say, a political reset for the current crisis between the political elites. It is not a solution in the long term, obviously, but a new election would probably mean, again, an amended election system, thereby an amended electoral system, in the sense that perhaps not necessarily going back to what we had before, but coming to kind of maybe a hybrid system that includes transferable votes with non-transferable votes in a way that they could sort of predetermine the outcome of the election result, ensuring that there wouldn't be such a big discrepancy between the biggest winning party, in this case the Sadrists, and then the framework. That would be the first point, or I think the first purpose that a new election would serve. Now, the other thing is, and if we come to the two-third quorum rule, is that either ahead of the next elections, there will be a political understanding to somehow amend this mechanism, or the political elite will again be forced to go back to the consensus tradition, therefore aligning their alliances during or before and after elections in a way that they would ensure that there would be a two-third majority for the president, as we've seen in most elections in the past. But this would also kind of push us back towards a scenario where there is no real opposition in the Iraqi parliament, which is a part of the issue. Now, of course, we have one-third, and I think you alluded to that in your initial remarks, a third emerging, let's say, political force of new parties. They haven't had the chance to distinguish themselves from the political elites during this period, simply because Parliament actually hasn't really convened or been able to do its work as usual. So that would be an interesting development to follow in the next election, whether these emerging parties, despite not having had a chance to show what they go for or put forward their political agenda in Parliament, whether they would be re-elected and thereby could form some form of opposition.
No, thank you so much, Lahib. I will come back to you asking different question about the possibility of the continuation of the current government, because I think what Sadr wants is just not another early election, but also under which government, the process that will lead to the next elections. I will come back to you. And now I will move to Dr. Bilal. As we promised in the introduction, that we'll be talking about the long-term implications of the current political crisis for the country as well. One of the aspects of the current political crisis is the emerging of power of big individuals, big men, political figures that can really weaken the notion of institutions, government, state institutions, but also that make consensus among them harder, that make their rivalries more look personal than institutional or ideological. So what does really, how the current crisis, in your view, has also empowered the role of individuals, big, political figures, and what does that mean for the future of the country?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Kamaran, for hosting me, and I'm very pleased to be sharing this screen with Lahib. And I also extend my thanks to Asharq for hosting this conversation, where we are very politely scratching our heads as to what's happening in Iraq and what might be happening in the future. I have been, while scratching my head, perhaps pulling hair too, I've been thinking quite a bit about where to put the blame, and I've been thinking maybe in a two variable or two axes. Should I blame the game or the players? And I think to a large extent, it's actually both. So it's a question of how much this is the political gridlock is a factor of the players, or is it the game or the rules of the game? Now, of course, I should probably just be the first to say that the players in today's politics, Iraqi politics, are also making the rules of the game as they go. So it's a strange mix of both, I would say. But as I started looking at the role of the players, and maybe an idea basically struck when I was giving an interview at some point, and a reporter asked me, why did Sadr withdrew? Excuse me. And I basically said, I have no idea. Why would Sadr do X? Or why would, Halbousi do Y? Or why would Barzani do Z? You don't know, because much of what's going on in Iraq, and I said this on live TV, I said it's the TV's fault for inviting like a political scientist or international relations, an academic to explain what's going on in Iraq. What you need is a psychologist or a fortune teller or a shaman, someone who can actually read people's minds rather than someone who can analyze the rationale. So my friend and co-author of an upcoming piece, Dr. Sardar Aziz, a renowned Kurdish academic, we actually embarked on looking at this question a little bit more seriously, because in post-Saddam Iraq and Iraqi politics, the politics itself has evolved, but also bifurcated in a number of directions. And the opposition politics, pre-Saddam Hussein in the diaspora, was mainly dominated by political parties, because many of the political heads not only could not be figureheads, but they actually had to adopt, nom de gores and hide their personality. We remember how even like former prime minister had to come back and, the name is actually not this is their actual name. So there was an interest in hiding behind the veil or behind a fake name and let the party be the face. Soon after that, after Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed and the constitution passed and Iraq had to go to early elections, There's been volumes written about this, that Iraq and the Iraqi system and the state maybe was not ready for elections, but that's a different conversation. The new emergent dynamic was, because of the early elections, was ethno-sectarianism, and this has been again explained and analyzed ad nauseum as to being the structural failure of Iraq to be stable, but also to govern. And of course, opening the doors for all kinds of regional and international interference. But I think looking forward, and maybe these past two elections being, the guinea pig, the petri dish, it is what I started with. It's more and more about strong men and political families, not political parties, let alone ideologies or platforms. And these political rivalries among strong men or big men is really within the ethno-sectarian communities. You don't see a competition between, let's say, a very strong Sunni leader who's challenging an equally powerful Shia leader. No, it's the KDP and the PUK, but not really the KDP PUK. It's the Barzani political family and the Talabani political family. If you look at Kurdistan, and maybe that's where this dynamic is most advanced. If advanced is the right word here, because they've had more time to perhaps perfect or go along this trajectory. So, I grew up in Kurdistan, and I remember knowing all of the names of the Politburo members of the KDP and the PUK, because these were mostly men, but men of stature, men of power. But I actually don't know them anymore, and it's actually my job to know, but I don't know them anymore because they don't really have power. It's about the political families. And therefore, most of the intrigue about Kurdish politics is, what's going on, not between KDP and PUK as much, but what's going on between, the Talabani cousins, or, which made headlines last year. And also what's happening between the Barzani cousins, which is, not so much in the headlines, but those in the know who closely follow Kurdish politics, or those who live in Kurdistan, are very much aware of. You wanna shift to look at the opposition, just to say that it's not a matter of ruling political parties. You had a similar dynamic with the opposition movement, Goran. It started with a charismatic leader. This charismatic leader could not manage to build the kind of institutions that would allow the movement to continue. He passed down the political party, the ownership of the party, quite literally, to his sons. And in a way, that was the end of that movement and the momentum that movement created, the Goran movement. You look at the Shia House, you see similar dynamics. Look at ISKI, the Supreme Council of Islamic Revolution, being led by the Al-Hakim family, and then it's the head of the political party who actually defects and creates a separate movement, the Al-Hikma movement, because the goal is to have better control of the party that you are presiding over. You look at Dawah Party, which is one of the oldest and definitely best recognized political parties in Iraq. It's actually not so much about the party platform, the ideology, the history. It's basically about the divisions within, the Maliki arm and the Abadi arm, and how the fight over who becomes the prime minister within Dawah Party has really divided the party into factions. And then, of course, you look at the Sunni House. I can't even name the main political parties anymore because it's all about big men like Speaker Halbousi, Khamis al-Khanja. So you have this dynamic, I think, going on where the figureheads have become better known than the ideologies or the platforms or even the political parties that they represent. Someone like Sadr might have been actually ahead of the curve because he never bothered even build a political party. He just started with it's a Sadrist movement. So everyone is expendable because it's all about Sadr, and you could be somebody today and then tomorrow you are a nobody. So this dynamic that Dr. Sadat and I are detailing in our upcoming report on this is also creating some new trends in Iraqi politics, like myth or hero manufacturing, a lot of revisionist history. I was at Malcolm Gladwell's presentation yesterday, so I'm reminded of that podcast. Some new terms like a secular marja, for example, which is a term that's being used in Kurdistan. These are new inventions that did not exist in the past, but they have become part of the political lingo in Iraq. Very briefly, I'll talk about the rationale, maybe the enablers for this dynamic, and maybe and conclude with the impact. I think the rationale is that the democratic practice in Iraq is fragile. People only practice democracy because, these are all, I cannot call these characters that I just went through, some of them as, Democrats or Democrats at heart, but they have to play by the rules of elections and competitive politics because no one has to date accumulated enough power, raw power and legitimacy to dominate everyone else. So they go along this game of elections and competitive politics. And I think in a patronage system, what Iraq is, Iraqi politics is all about patronage rather than, competing ideas and ideologies or actually even people or ethno-sectarian. When this form of politics, patronage-based politics, is the dominant form, it's a lot easier to build loyalty around a person than around an idea. Because patronage requires someone to be thanked and someone to be loyal to. It's easier for that to be a figurehead rather than a political party or a platform. So it's expedient, it's easy, I might say it's lazy. And in a system where accountability is elusive, the leader can always say, here is my ring and kiss it, or here's my hand and kiss it. When something goes wrong, it's always the system's fault or it's the other side's fault. The reason why Tishreen movement was kind of a revolution against the entire system was because they said, well, we don't know whose face to punch, so we're just going to punch the face of every politician or every political party. Enablers for this new dynamic that I think is a good way. I'm not saying it's a new way or the only way, but I think it's another useful way of analyzing Iraqi politics, if not admiring it too much. The enablers are basically a tribal culture. Oh, go ahead, Kakamara.
No, I don't want to really interrupt you, but it's a very, very interesting discussion. I think the bringing the Barzani-Talabani framework to the rest of the country, what's happening in Kurdistan, it's mostly a rivalry between two families, if we call two parties, whatever, two parts. But then when you go to the south, it's very fragmented, it's very fluid. There exist different centers of power, and these different factions haven't yet been able to create a territory. In Kurdistan, we have very clear border. This is my territory, this is your territory. So there is kind of stability because there is a stable control over territory. But right. Then when you go to the south, the rivalry is more within the state institutions, within how they infiltrate into the state economy, that's making the whole process much more fragile, more volatile. Whenever there is a change in the balance of power in the interests, and then we will see a lot of instability impacting the whole of country. I will ask you a question here. In 3 days, especially here in Erbil, we will have the 5th anniversary of the Kurdistan referendum for independence. Of course, people celebrate it differently. There exists completely different beliefs and views about what happened 5 years ago. Right. And most of the analysis of the current political crisis focus on the intra-Shia power rivalries, the framework and the Sadrist movement. Where are Kurds in the current political crisis of Iraq, and what do they want?
First of all, let me agree with your analysis that a difference between Kurdish politics and perhaps Iraqi politics is that the lines are better defined and delineated in Kurdistan than they are, let's say, in the rest of Iraq. But let's remember why that is. It's because Kurdistan had a civil war which is one thing that we're all hoping and praying that Iraq avoids. So every time we warn about the civil war, we're basically saying don't repeat what happened in Kurdistan, because you end up with, shifting to your question now. Kurdistan was formed in 1992, so 30 years later, it still does not have a constitution. There was a time that the parliament was the main institution, the main arbiter of disputes or legislation. But now it's back not even to Politburo meetings, but to whether the two leaders meet and whether the two leaders win each other's respect. And this personalization of politics has really harmed Kurdish democracy, Kurdish governance. I mean, I was going to get to the enablers and the impact. So the enablers would be that tribal structure, and also Iraq's rent-based, oil-based economy, where political rivalry and competition is about who sits at the table, I guess at the dinner table, at a very fat and rich dinner table, and this is all contribute to, but it's also because of state weakness. So this is what's happening in Kurdistan. This dynamic, which I said is more advanced in Kurdistan, because initially it was a division between two political parties with Peshmerga forces and loyalties and even loyal bases. You remember, in Kurdistan, people would color you with, the rosary bead that's in your hand, or like who you voted for in like 30 years ago, or what kind of family you are, and they will label you as KDP and PUK. But not anymore. I don't think the KDP and the PUK even care about that as much, because it's really not about that. It's about, looking very inwardly, and it's about consolidation of power. And the impact has been that the state has been further weakened. I mean, looking at Kurdistan, I see that the challenges are rising. The gravity of the problems that the KRG faces are increasingly more dangerous. I mean, you have Iran firing cruise missiles at Erbil. You have militias almost quite regularly attacking the urban centers as well as the oil and gas facilities. You have the Supreme Court undermining the entire legal basis of the KRG oil and gas industry, and then you have the Ministry of Oil piling on with directives, and then on top of that you have the national oil companies. So, I mean, Turkey on one hand is encroaching deeper and deeper and killing civilians in their attack. So, I mean, in the face of all of these challenges, I mean, let alone the international, I mean, we all heard President Biden yesterday, and if there was a word that did not even come up, that was the word Iraq. So, in this dynamic, which I think would probably should be alarming for the Kurdish leaders to then come and invest in a capacity to stand up to these challenges, to withstand these challenges, let alone seize some of the opportunities that any crisis would present. They're actually becoming smaller in their ambition. So to answer your specific question, I don't know what the Kurdish vision is. I think before the referendum, there was at least this implied sense that Kurdistan is building itself after having been disillusioned with Iraq and the constitution and the Kurdish return to Iraqi politics. There was a sense, especially under Maliki, with the threat of F-16s, there was a change in the Kurdish mentality that the Kurdish leaders started, maybe not so bluntly, but the one time Kurdistan was going to be the new Sweden of the Middle East. It became the second Dubai. Well, it became the other Iraq, then became the second Dubai. But then there was a sense that, yes, this is a movement toward independence. So you can understand Kurdistan as KRG's foreign policy, all of these representative offices. Then you could understand the, let's say, the energy policy and some of the economic inefficiencies, and that's a euphemism, by the way, that were used in managing the oil and gas industry and the revenues. All of that was basically glanced over, or people turned a blind eye toward, because the goal was independence. But then the referendum happened. That was the opportunity. And then I think it was a very crude awakening that the region isn't ready. The international community isn't ready. The region doesn't accept. And Kurdistan isn't ready either. I mean, for example, when the militias and the Iraqi army together attacked Kurdish forces, there wasn't much of a resistance. And then the other part I think which is important is, like Iraq, and perhaps it's also a Middle Eastern phenomenon, not just that the vision is lacking, but there is no reckoning as to what happened. For example, I'm yet to see a serious analysis of the Kurdish civil war where there is accountability. The two Kurdish leaders, when they made peace, for example, they said it wasn't our fault, and that was the end of it. And then, of course, with the referendum, now you cannot offer an analysis. You have to be either with the referendum and then praise it, and therefore you're taking the KDP line, or you can say, oh, this was like a mistake, and therefore you're taking the PUK line. There is no rational, objective analysis as to what happened and what are the lessons that the KRG should learn from, and then revisit and assess it. I mean, let me give you another example on the positive side. The Kurdish Peshmerga had a very influential role in fighting ISIS, and they were part of an international coalition. But the KRG hasn't really produced its own version or a history other than, stories in the media, but a version of the history and the lessons learned from this Kurdish participation in an international war against ISIS. So this element of reckoning of like what is next, this is what I see missing 5 years after the referendum. You can still, some of them focus on October 16th and they talk about treason, and others talk about, the glory of the referendum. Others still go back and talk about, the KDP version of October 16th, which was in 1996, when the Iraqi troops were brought back to Erbil. So there's a lot of blame game, but I don't see vision. I don't see a plan. I don't see a new approach as to what the KRG wants. And I think part of it is because the political leaders are basically just busy with consolidating personal power, family power. It's about passing on the baton to the next generation. But all of that is at the expense of weakening the KRG institutions. And again, some of the mistakes that the KRG is doing in terms of democratic regression, human rights regression, and expending the political capital that it has built over the years, even in the eyes of the international community.
Dr. Bilal, I know it's a very early morning in Washington, but you have given us a lot, I'm joking, a very pessimistic overview of the politics in the country. No, it's very realistic description of what's happening. Laheeb,
I'm sorry about that.
No. You are in Baghdad. When we discuss the scenarios. You explain it clearly about the early election. Why it's important to normalize the current political process. It's not a solution. It's not the right way to address the structural weaknesses of the Iraqi system. But there is also another scenario analysis in Baghdad and other parts of the country discuss about the possibility of the continuation of the current government under the leadership of Mustafa al-Kadhimi. At least this is how they can convince al-Sadr in case if the government, if the parliament continues to function within the under the power of the coordination framework, excluding Sadr. So what do you think? How do different political parties or different individuals, big men in Baghdad and other parts of the country can view the continuation of the government?
Okay, well, absolutely. There are many scenarios that I think still are possible. And the reason for that, obviously, is that we haven't seen a solution to government formation, right? So we're still awaiting an understanding between the Kurdish parties on the president, for instance, which is key to go forward. But I do think that the Shia coordination framework might consider two things. I think that their first goal or their first desire would be to form a new government, which is what they're still pushing for, at least publicly in the media, right? I think there is a way for them to do that without provoking sort of another escalation with Sadr, and that is to bring Sadr in through the back door, let's say, right? Which is sort of a consensus again. So you form a government that is led by the framework parties, but where Sadr actually indirectly holds still cabinet positions. So appointing a sort of Sadr loyalist ministers in the ministries that have traditionally been a part of Sadr's share, let's say. So that could be one solution. The other solution is the one that you mentioned, which is that the Kadhimi government continues. I think this looks difficult simply because many of the framework, or the key framework parties, let's say, Nouri al-Maliki, the former prime minister, but also some of the groups that are tied to the Hashd al-Sha'bi, simply refuse his continuation, because I don't think that they trust that Kadhimi will shift to act as a more balancing prime minister among the Shiite forces. So what they have seen over the last couple of years is that Kadhimi has kind of facilitated the entry of Sadrists into key positions in the executive branch. And so then, he would have to roll that back, and then we don't know what Sadr's reaction will be to that. So it appears as if we need another few weeks to make a more qualified, analysis of which of these scenarios that is actually going to be the fallout in the end. Obviously, there is, let's say, international and even a regional preference for Kadhimi continuing for other reasons, because there are many regional dialogues that are going on, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps that will sway the Iraqis in that direction in the end. But what I see is that, and also as Bilal described very well with Kurdish politics, and it also goes to the politics in the south, is this very personalized conflicts, right? I mean, what we've seen happening over the last few months is not so much a conflict between Sadr and the framework as a whole. The framework actually comprises a set of different positions. It is mainly a conflict between Sadr and his arch enemy, let's say, right? Former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki on the one hand, and on the other hand, mainly one of the leaders within the Hashd, which is Qais al-Khazali, the leader of Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, that also has a personalized conflict with Sadr going back to the early 2000s when they actually fought together in Sadr's Mahdi army, and then Qais al-Khazali split off. So even the clashes that we've seen that occurred in the Green Zone, later in Basra, really carries these personal tensions more than they are telling us that we are looking at an all-out intra-Shia fight. Now, this doesn't mean that it won't happen, and I just want to confirm what Bilal said earlier, which is that the South hasn't seen that type of civil war, right? There was a sectarian war that was obviously fought out between Sunnis and Shia mainly, but we haven't had the equivalent of the Kurdish civil war. It is possible that further down the line, this will be, unfortunately, if the political system doesn't hold, the only way for some of these heads of the Shia house to actually fight out the territory among themselves, right? But I do think, and I know this wasn't a part of the question, but I think it's important to raise this, is that there is a way out of this. I mean, another of these structural issues that I would mention right now, to why it's so difficult for the political parties to split up the cake the way that they have used to, is that they themselves have limited, the pie. And what I mean by that is, for instance, that there is so few opportunities to divide up power right now. We don't have provincial councils anymore that are functioning. Those were dissolved. That is one way to actually distribute power through these patronage networks in the provinces, right? So you don't have that. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that, all of these political parties go back to say that we need to respect the Constitution. Obviously, none of them are respecting the Constitution. The constitutional deadlines to form a government have been broken, et cetera, et cetera. But there are articles within the Constitution that would also help with power sharing that haven't been enacted. So the Federal Council, for instance, and there are several other parts of this. We don't even need to go into Article 140, which relates to the disputed territories, because that is a whole discussion in and of itself. But these political elites have also, painted themselves into a corner where the sort of lower level of politics are irrelevant, right? As Bilal said, it has become more and more personalized, more and more concentrated power or feuds among families or the top enclaves of the political elite, and they can do something to redistribute this in a way that they don't actually end up in a situation where it comes to violence being the only solution to kind of set a new political contract between them.
Thank you so much, Laheeb. I've received some questions, and I will again invite the participants to write their questions in the chat box if they have any comments or questions. I've received two questions. One is for Dr. Bilal and the other for Laheeb. And also they are also related to my own, questions that I prepared for you for later discussions. I would start with Laheeb, and then I will change a bit the direction of the discussion and address the more international perspectives, and then come back to you, Dr. Bilal. Laheeb, there is a question about the protest movement, so where they are in the current political crisis. Because if you remind ourselves, the entire early election was the demand of the protest movements of October. And then they failed to organize themselves, and participate in the election in a coherent, cohesive way, but still made some progress. They managed to the parliament. And now with the political crisis, political deadlock, they were almost like watching the developments, not able to influence. Now we are talking about another early election, which is the demand of Al-Sadr and other factions. Where do the protest movements, the real protest movements of October are? Where are they?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think I briefly mentioned it in my initial remarks. The new parties that emerge out of the Tishreen protest movement that made it into parliament haven't really been able to set their mark on the political scene, precisely because the crisis that we go through now is an elite crisis, or a crisis of the establishment. And I think that in a scenario where we would have had another consensus government, it would have been a prime opportunity for these parties to represent some sort of opposition politics, right? To represent a new vision, or have the opportunity to hone that vision. Unfortunately, I think that the fragmentation that we already saw within the Tishreen movement has developed further because they haven't been able to distinguish themselves, right? So we see now that some of the MPs, for instance, under the main party that came into parliament, Imtidad, have left Imtidad and have become more independent, in that way kind of raising their voices individually. But we also have another trend, and that was the parties that decided to boycott the elections, not thinking that there would be much use of participating in elections, considering the, let's say, repressive political system, or the disadvantage that they are in contrast to the established political parties. Many of those parties regretted their decision. And so I think that we will see another renewed participation in elections should we have early elections, or whenever elections occur. So they're not gone, but they will have a problem in the future too to organize themselves. And I think another kind of development that we see among them is that because they are caught up or isolated in a way from the current establishment crisis, some of them are also considering whether it is efficient to continue as a protest type of political force, right? We see a certain trend among some of these parties to actually join forces more with Sadr. Sadr is still adopting their rhetoric, right? Being anti-establishment, although he is not. But they see that Sadr might be, of the two evils, he is the lesser evil, right? This might not be a correct reading of the reality, but I think it is also an understandable one for a young movement that represents an organic outburst of discontent, which 2019 protests were. There was no organization to them. Many of their demands were negotiated or formulated as these young people met in the protest squares. And who was the most dominating force or best organized force there? It was the Sadrists. So the Sadrists were the ones who were able to take advantage because they knew what they wanted. They took out of the Tishreen movement what was beneficial to them, that was early elections, and they left everything else aside, right? So where the Tishreen movement had much more far-reaching demands of actually an overhaul of the system, Sadr was not interested in that. And he didn't need to honor that either. He went as far as his own political goals required, and that was an election and amended electoral law, which again was negotiated with the other with the counterparts in the political elite, not with the protesters. So I think that they will be there, but they will continue to struggle to sort of find their way. And I think unless they formulate a convincing political vision for the future of Iraq, and there's signs of it, but it's not a very coherent one, at least yet. I think they will continue to be sort of in the background of Iraqi politics for the foreseeable future, at least.
Thank you so much, Laheeb. And now I will come back to you, Dr. Bilal. We have three questions in the chat, both addressing, all the three questions addressing really the regional international aspect of the dimension of what's happening in Iraq. The first question is related to the US perspective. I think for long in Iraq, one of the major analytical framework was the Sunni Kurdish, Shia divide. And now in this panel, I think you have brought a new model, a new explanatory framework, which I think has the potential to really offer nuanced perspective of what's happening, the framework of big men, big personalities. But in Washington, few days ago, there was a US delegation to Iraq. They were framing their policy as a policy based on engagement with state institutions, state sovereignty. But now, your model, your explanatory framework of big men, and then the narrative of state institutions. If you apply your explanatory analytical framework, how do you assess the US position? How the events are viewed in Washington?
That's an excellent question. But allow me to preface my answer by highlighting something that Laheeb said about how local governments have been almost disbanded, other than the position of the governor. I think that is a very important point and hasn't been receiving the attention it deserves, because it goes along one of the factors, I think, of the dynamic of why Baghdad has become the center of much politics is because decentralization has been taken a step back or has been rolled back in favor of centralization. I mean, you go to Erbil and you hear, for example, I mean, one time just jokingly, but turned out to be rather telling, I took one of the speeches by the prime minister in which he was blaming Baghdad and how centralized Baghdad is and how disrespectful of federalism it has become. And I just changed the word in like Google Doc or Word document, every word Erbil or KRG to Basra. And that would have been a perfect speech given by the governor of Basra. So this centralization is a dynamic that's going along along this, I think, this evolution of politics, because that's where the cake is, again, to borrow a word that Lahib used. Not to be too pessimistic, though, I think while the Iraqi politicians, as parties or families or strong men, big men, they have their own dynamic, but they're also responsive to the public. The public is a variable, it's a factor. Let's not forget the monumental achievement of Tishreen. They forced an Iraqi prime minister to resign. And it did not become violent despite having, hundreds killed and thousands wounded and maimed. No Iraqi politician can just turn a blind eye on that. Not because they are, good men, but because they just cannot afford it. So, for example, one of the major problems that Sadr and the Sadr movement faces is that the health sector and the electricity sector are among the worst in the region. They're definitely very bad in Iraq. And he cannot say that wasn't my fault, because they have been under different Sadr administrations from the get-go. He has to face that music. And there is only so much Baghdad blaming that the KRG can do for why it cannot pay the salaries on time. Yes, they blamed Baghdad cutting the budget. They blamed oil prices being low. They blamed ISIS. Okay. But that was in 2017, maybe in 2014. We're in 2022. The guy has to deliver, right? He's running out of excuses. The excuses are becoming blunt. And so, yes, against this trend of personalization of politics and concentration of power in the individual or in the political family, you also have a public that is more vocal, more demanding, and powerful and strong enough that these leaders simply cannot ignore. So if I want to think a bit positively, it is this dynamic that gives me a little bit of hope toward the future. Let's all look how the public pressure has changed the election system over and over again. So it's not just kind of an autocratic class that is dictating on the society. The Iraqi society is an actor, it's an agent, it's a very important variable, and the leaders have to basically heed their demands. And this is basically my intro to answer your question about U.S. policy. I think the U.S., if it's doing something right, it's investing in that dynamic. It's basically saying Iraq is not just about the leaders, and therefore all these leaders come and talk to the leaders. I was, for example, personally very, very pleased to see that the Assistant Secretary of State, in her last visit, you alluded to it, did not just go and meet with the big men. And unfortunately, they were all men with a few exceptions. But she also went to the bazaar, she went to the campuses, and she came to met with journalists, met with think tankers. So that's a nod to the street, that's a nod to the public, that's a nod to the intellectuals, that's a nod to the free press that's been taking a back step. The visit by the defense, by the Pentagon delegation, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, a lot of focus on Peshmerga reform. You, by the way, Kamran, had an excellent piece about this 2 days ago, in which you talk about the demand for Peshmerga reform, but also the ability to actually supply that reform, the international pressure versus the local dynamic. That's very important, but imagine how much worse the dynamic would be if there wasn't that US incentive, carrot, but also the sticks that come associated with removing that. And there were indeed threats of ending that kind of aid. So the US, there are things that the US is doing right. They engaged in Iraq. They did not leave the way they did Afghanistan. The strategic framework still gets attention from both Baghdad and Washington. There has been de-escalation since the days of rocketing the embassy and the killing of Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. There is this, as I said, acknowledgement of Iraqi agency. I think at the leadership level, Washington has been very disappointed. But there is also, looking at the street and the public dynamic, the pressures from the public. So basically, they're looking at how that dynamic is going to play out. They're kind of taking a backseat. They still support Kadhimi, but not as vocally and as let's say as strongly as they did Abadi in 2018. But in a way, they're also not as vocal as the United States once was. But also, I think there is a dynamic is that Washington underappreciates its leverage in Iraq. It thinks that it doesn't have as much leverage. But I think Iraqis also overestimate Washington's leverage. So there is kind of a balance to be drawn there. I think overall, the fact that Washington is maintaining the pressure on ISIS, is still leading the coalition, is still allowing the cash to flow, protecting Iraqi cash flow, in a way, maybe inadvertently, is subsidizing the political gridlock. I mean, there is no real meaningful reason for this political gridlock. You don't have a financial crisis, you don't have an ISIS crisis, you don't have a civil war going on. In a way, this is a fight of luxury. Like, Sadr does this because he can afford it. Maliki can do this because he can afford it. The family dynamics in Kurdistan, I mean, they have no problem. So they have to create a problem. In a way, they're being subsidized. And I think this is Washington's main leverage. But I don't think folks here appreciate that as much, in part because there is a World War II or III trying to be averted in Ukraine. And then, of course, JCPOA is kind of the elephant in the room on how you deal with Iran. Yes, you want to de-escalate, but you also don't want to agitate. So there's a lot going on where Iraq is just not making enough noise to get attention. But also, so it's not bad enough for Washington to engage more. But I think Washington, if it wanted, there is more that Washington could do. It still has a lot of leverage, both by way of carrots and sticks, and being able to rally the region and the attention of the region to Iraq. I think they are re-engaging. I mean, yes, they helped the election. I wrote about this, but then they disengaged since the election. But now we see that there's a flurry of activity. So hopefully Washington is playing catch up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bilal. We have many questions addressing to both of you. One of them is a question from Khoger Muhammad. He's asking, wouldn't placing focus on internal political dynamics, in your case, Dr. Bilal, the power of individuals, or Lahib, as you mentioned, the patronage system, the consensus system that reduce the regional influence, such as Iran and Turkey. If I put the question frame it in another way, is it just an internal crisis, or we have missed the element of the regional element in our analysis? So, Lahib, you can address the question first, and Dr. Bilal, if you want to comment on this as well.
Sure, thanks for that. So, I think that, one of the reasons why we see such a big crisis among the established political elite in Iraq is because the regional dynamic is missing more, right? I mean, it is not only the US that has disengaged. Iran is, of course, still there, but does not play the same role that it did as before the killing of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. We have seen that the Iranian response to what happens in Iraq is more fragmented, whereas before there was more clearly one policy, I think. Now there are several institutions within the Iranian establishment that perhaps even pursues sometimes different goals, right? So between the intelligence and the IRGC, etc. So I think that is one dynamic, which is actually leaving the Iraqi political actors to fend for themselves in a way that they're not used to. If we look at the whole post-2003 dynamic, many of these political elites, especially those that returned, right, from exile, we're speaking about the Da'wah Party people, about the KDP, about the PUK, most of them really, except for Sadr, right, which is one of those political figures whose family never left Iraq and who draws his popular support from that partly. I think that we see a crisis where they can no longer kind of sort out their differences with their counterparts alone, because they don't have that type of hand-holding that we used to see from both the US and Iran. I mean, in the early days, even after the Constitution was written, there used to be an American, a diplomat or a commander of some sort, sitting in meetings, you know, helping the Iraqis negotiate. So that dynamic has changed significantly, and that is, let's say, an unfortunate legacy of the occupation, right? Where we have a political elite that is actually quite incapable of resolving their issues on their own. So in a way, this moment is important for them to find their ways on their own, hopefully peacefully. And I mean, this is where the risk is, right? Is that, okay, if they cannot, if they don't have a sufficient amount of tools to do it peacefully, they will resort to violence. But to come to the question of like placing focus on political figures, well, I mean, who is to place this focus, right? I mean, if they are part of the problem, it is very difficult to remove them, obviously, and we saw that as a failure of Tishrin, right? Is that the status quo is very, very strong in Iraq, and you don't have a political force that is actually challenging the establishment. Even the interventions by the Marja'iyya, for instance, right? So Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani was very active during the protest movement, but he is still someone that pushes to preserve the system. So how do you navigate this balance where a revolution or a complete overhaul of the system is not possible, but we also have a risk of kind of sliding back into some sort of civil strife? And I think this is the issue. And I agree with Bilal that I think that it's not only the US, but also other Western actors are actually more focusing on institution building, let's say, on civil society, to, sort of acknowledging that there is another political direction represented by the street in terms of what they would like to see for the country, in contrast to the sort of the same patterns that the elites are repeating. So yes, I mean, the elites are a part of the problem, but they can only. I mean, there is not. We see this with the dissolution of parliament, right? They are the only ones that can decide to dissolve parliament. So at the end of the day, we are stuck with them for a while. But there are other processes that we can support in order for that dynamic to change in the longer term.
Yeah, thank you. I will combine the other questions before giving the opportunity to Dr. Bilal again. Dr. Bilal, do you want to comment on the question of Hoger about the regional element?
The picture that we're painting of Iraq is not only a challenge for Iraqi leaders themselves, but also for the regional patrons. I mean, Turkey, the United States, Iran, you know, the Gulf countries, they have to deal with this as well. And if confrontation and disagreement among Iraqi leaders are personal, quite literally, what could Iran do? And in fact, just a point on Iran, because there was also a question about the protests in Iran. It just also shows you that Iran is not the giant that everyone thinks it is. It's a factor of Iraqi weakness. It's about how welcoming Iraq is, how open Iraq is to be influenced, and that's perhaps why Iran is so successful at influencing politics in Iraq. But just look at how weak Iran has been since the demise of Qasem Soleimani. So there is like, you know, another example of how personalities matter, leaders, you know, matter. But I think more structurally, not beyond just a single leader, the Tishrin movement, the chants of Iraq is free, Iran get out. I mean, that resonated in Tehran, that resonated in Qom, because the Tishrin movement was a wake-up call for Iran, in part because these were primarily Shia youth, one, and two, they more or less had Najaf's support. I mean, that's why they managed to oust the prime minister, to force the prime minister to resign. So even Iran has to, going back to the point I was making earlier, that, you know, do not discount the Iraqi public, the Iraqi streets. They're angry, but they're also hopeful. And that's a very dangerous cocktail. They're angry at their own government, but they're also hopeful of the potential of the country. And they look around and they're starting to identify who are the people who are stopping the country from being what it should be, because yes, it's a Muslim country. They look around, they see a ton of Muslim countries who have stability. It's a wealthy country. They look around at other oil-rich countries in the region. They say, they don't look like us. And they look around and they say, okay, here's the barrier. This line of people are the barrier between where we are and where we can be. So, if I were an Iraqi politician, I would be quite scared of that. And I think Iran has really gotten the memo. Tehran has gotten the memo. So I was talking about how Washington is having kind of a hands-off approach, but Iran has been having a hands-off approach too. Go talk to the Shia leaders. They complained that, in the past when we had a problem, people would come from Tehran and they would help us and mediate and talk to both sides. Now they say, this is a you problem, as American teenagers would say. So they're telling Iraqis, this is a you problem. Yes, Iran can have its own national interests, preserved, and they can send a signal, a cruise missile there, an attack there, a bomb here, some money there. They can still preserve their national interests, making sure that Iraq does not become a threat to Iran. So they still preserve that, but they don't have to micromanage Iraqi politics. They don't really need to, because when they were doing that, it wasn't really helping them that much. They still get this, sell Iraqi gas, sell their gas to Iraq. They still make sure that, the revenues that Iraq makes from selling oil ends up buying Iranian products. And they make sure that Iraq will never become a place where Iran can be threatened. So as a state, looking at its own national security, Iran is not in a bad place. So they don't really need to anger the Iraqi public anymore. And again, maybe also for them, especially for Mr. Qani, who doesn't have Qasem Soleimani's Arabic language skills, that is basically a perfect excuse for him not to be, schmoozing as much as his predecessor used to.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is also another element, which I think is going to be also my questions to all of you. Almost like 60% of the Iraqi population are under 25 now, which meaning that they have not seen the Ba'athist regime. They have only seen the current Iraq, known by mismanagement and corruption. So the country it has one of the most rapid population growth in the region. The youth is now representing the majority of the country. You have I think that in this panel, we have really addressed the structural weaknesses of the system, whether it's patronage system, the power of individuals, the weakness of state institutions. But I will ask both of you a very provocative question. We are recommending, or we are asking international actors or all stakeholders to support the society, civil society, the street, the youth, women activists. But then we have this political establishment in power. Do you think this is also not in a bad faith, but this is not also enabling an environment for further violent confrontations between the state and between the different elites and powers with the street? Because empowering the street means like they are more active in demanding what they want, and then confronting them with the elites that have so much at stake to consolidate their patronage system. I think this is going to be, I would say, difficult to manage, to balance between supporting civil society and other actors while these people are in power. Yeah, Laib, you can start.
Sure. Obviously, I agree with what you are saying. It will not be easy to empower or support the young demographic. I think that, unfortunately, we will go on in a situation where most of the political elites turned a blind eye to the realities of the ground. And we have seen this not only in the south, but also in the Kurdistan region, right? So the response is crackdown rather than engagement. And if we look at 2019 and the, let's say, quite successful crackdown, right, by the state, supported by paramilitary groups that are part of the state, and an extension supported by Iran, I think that it will be difficult to repeat the same scenario as efficiently as it was done then, because I think everyone within the establishment was sort of on board with that, even though there was a lot of bloodshed. So if you look at how they are acting now in terms of forming a government, there is absolutely no regard to, or no memory of what happened just 2 years ago. Now, how do you change the political elites to understand that urgency? I think it is still, a very worthwhile investment in Iraq's youth when it comes to sort of enhancing the human capital, right? I mean, another big part, I would say, of the difficulty for Iraq's younger demographic to actually sort of build a reliable or a coherent type of political force is also their poor education, right? And we've seen that the skills that some of these young people honed during the or prior to, which helped them with the in the protest movement, actually came very much from the fact that we have had an international presence of international organizations. Many of these young people have been part of international civil society, of NGOs. The social media usage has also been supported from the outside. I mean, the way that they employed this as they organized is also thanks to that opening that has happened in Iraq post-2003, right? And that there is another type of influence and sort of positive type of education in the system, but it is not something that can substitute a good education system, and this is really lacking. So I would say, that would be one side. And then the other one, and I think that is perhaps the most acute one, where political elites at least temporarily realize that they need to address the grievances of young people, and that is work opportunities, right? So if you look at every time we have an economic issue, right, of cash flow into the country, oil prices go down, the government has to lay off people from the government payroll, which is always very controversial because it's essentially the only safe kind of employment that you have in this country. They start kind of grappling to find ways to get out of that. So, I think that there are parts of the elites, perhaps even if not the higher enclaves, that realize that. I think in the future there is small signs of more of a push or investments in small and medium enterprises that often it is younger people that lead that development. In tech, for instance, in Iraq, we can see that, but that needs to be expanded. But I mean, this is really investments for the longer term. I don't think that there is a quick fix to this issue. The other one is obviously that the international community actually supports dialogue processes in Iraq. When Iraqi political elites talk about national dialogue, who do they mean? Themselves. They do not include civil society in that. That is what the international community needs to come in and push for. So you actually have a comprehensive dialogue about what the political system needs to look like, not a dialogue that is held among the establishment that haven't been able to renew themselves for the past 2 decades.
Thank you, Laïb. I think you have partly also answered the question of Monique from The Hague about who can be a mediating place or power on an actor. Dr. Bilal, I know you have a meeting in a few minutes, and thank you so much for being with us. I think you can answer this question, and then you can slowly, we can slowly end the webinar. The previous question about the international support to civil society, and who can be a mediating power, a mediating place. Laïb said local actors are not able, international actors at least can provide this space for bringing all those parties together in the current political fragmentation and polarization the country is facing? Thank you.
It's an important question, and Lahib gave an excellent answer. And the question about dialogue and making it inclusive of civil society, I think, is a crucial point, and I could not agree with her more. As I said, Iraqi youth and the public, which was on display in the Tishreen movement in the October 2019 uprising, I think that's a force to be reckoned with. I think the path for that kind of divorce between the leadership and the quality of the leadership and the public is going in a couple of maybe different, if not parallel, trajectories. One is, violence. That Tishreen movement, we may see a violent version of it. That's one possibility. Another possibility is for that to turn and become politics and challenge it. And then, yes, we saw some of them run into office. Some of them, the protest leaders, ended up in parliament. They were, after all, those who forced the election, forced the prime minister to resign. But there's also, I think, another dynamic that is, again, in parallel, not necessarily either or, is happening, is that I think the Iraqi society is learning to not only survive, but also thrive in spite of the state. Look at the small business scene, look at entrepreneurs, look at academics, look at, mushrooming think tanks, outlets, app designers. Yes, despite not being able to sell on App Store, musicians not being able to sell their music on Apple Music, content creators not being able to pay over YouTube, etc. But they still, they still produce the content, they still produce the art. The businesses, the pandemic, for example, created ample opportunities for people to find a way to help the society and make a living, despite all of the red tape and the corruption and the bureaucratic hurdles that the government puts in front of them. So I think that's a force to be reckoned with. But I also understand there was a couple of questions about sort of what's the alternative to the current system. You hear voices in Iraq, some talk about amending the constitution, which is something my colleague on the call, Safwan El-Amin, and I are writing a piece about soon. There are other calls that call for, okay, let's amend the constitution to make it a presidential system. Or, there are also calls that we saw in some of the questions. How about turning Iraq into a monarchy? Some basically yearn. You mentioned that the new generation don't really remember Saddam Hussein. So I mentioned myth creation. There could be a myth creation that turns Saddam Hussein into perhaps even a more evil than he was. But there's also revisionist history that say, look, under him, there were no car bombs, and maybe look back at his era as a more kind of a stable, the kind of stability that, authoritarian regimes give. But my caution to that is there is no formula of finding a nice king or kind of a less thuggish president. We just don't know how to do that. So we might as well invest and remain invested in democracy, making sure that every iteration of the elections becomes better. It worries me that the participation in the elections are going down. I understand it, but it worries me. So I think, as I said, if you look at, you said that I was pessimistic, but I think if you look at the iterations of the elections, there have been changes, multiple changes to the election system, to who can vote, to the participation rates. I mean, there is an Iraqi voice that is out there, that is loud, and you hear it in the street, you hear it in think tanks, you hear it in the press. I would not change, the ability to go into Baghdad, walk into a parliament, into a minister, and tell them, I read this piece, it says you're corrupt. Are you corrupt? That's invaluable. There are only few places in the Middle East where you can do that, where you can have a forum like this and talk about these leaders and call them by name, and then go and walk in Baghdad or streets of Erbil. I think these are valuable. They just need some strategic patience, not only from the international community, some nurturing and some guarding, but also from the Iraqi people, because we've tried a presidential system. It wasn't so beautiful. It wasn't so stable. It was brittle and it was brutal. Probably had a very short experience with monarchy, but I don't remember that. All I hear is that my mother-in-law says that, they were glorious days, but I'm sure that that's a version of revisionist history as well. So we have something going. There's a very vibrant society. There is a polity that, despite their kind of self-centered obsession, they still have to listen, and they still have to worry about what the people throw at them. That could be a shoe, that could be a vote.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bilal, for ending with something optimistic.
I tried.
Yeah, thank you. Lahib, we have tried a lot to analyze, explain things. So what will be your recommendation as a way forward for the country?
That is a large question. I think we need more than 2 minutes for that. But okay, I will say a few quick things. So I think we mentioned a few of them. There is a need for some sort of solution for a political reset right now to sort of take us out of this impasse that has actually proved violent at certain moments. Elections could be one way, but that really needs to be coupled with a kind of longer term roadmap where Iraqi political elites are actually kind of incentivized to engage with the public that they are supposed to serve. And I think that international actors can actually help facilitate that. And in that, there are many options to discuss in terms of the current political system, constitutional amendments, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think there's room to go into those details right now, but I would hope that Western actors, as well as regional actors, and I think it is more important for the regional actors in a way, as we've said, that most of them are not interested in instability in Iraq. So there's kind of no getting around the mess that we are in. And a part of that mess is, yes, the political elites themselves, but also the system that they have been using to their advantage. And that needs to start seeing some sort of amendments to it. So different ways of power sharing that go beyond the ones that we have now, etc. So I would hope that there would be kind of a more structured process where actors such as UNAMI and what they've already done, the EU, European countries could help facilitate that with some of the other actors that have had more of an interfering role in Iraq before, like the US or Iran, simply supporting those type of structural talks that need to happen between the elites and the public.
Wow, thank you so much, Lahib. Thank you for the active participation of the participants. I'm really grateful for Lahib and Bilal for sharing your deep knowledge and insights, addressing many of these complicated questions. Thank you for Al-Sharq for providing this space. We have a couple of more questions that we have not addressed, but I'm really sorry that we don't have time to answer of these questions. We look forward to other opportunities, trying to incorporate these questions into more future discussions. Lahib, thank you so much again for joining us from Baghdad, sharing your deep knowledge and insights. Thank you again for all of the participants. I think this is the end of our panel, and I look